too old and too poor," Louisa Pruett heard Mrs. Abernathy say from behind the punch table, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, to be seriously considered by a man like Walter Crane. Louisa kept her eyes on the needlework in her lap and her face carefully still, because she had spent 44 years learning that a woman's dignity was often the only thing left entirely in her own keeping, and she was not about to hand it over to a banker's wife at a harvest social. She had come to Red Bluff's autumn dance not out of any hope of catching the county's wealthiest rancher's eye, whatever the town's gossips assumed, but because Reverend Alcott had asked her to help chaperone the evening, and because staying home alone in the small rented room above the mercantile, mending strangers' clothes by lamplight, had begun to feel like a slow kind of drowning she wasn't yet ready to admit to. She was a seamstress, unmarried, her modest savings eaten steadily by winter that had cost more in coal than she'd budgeted, and she was, by every measure the town cared to apply, an unlikely candidate for anyone's notice, let alone Walter Crane's. Walter had lost his wife to consumption 3 years back and had spent the time since running the largest cattle operation in 3 counties with the same steady, unshowy competence he brought to everything, including, apparently, his own grief. He rarely attended town socials, and his presence at this one had set half of Red Bluff's marriageable daughters and their scheming mothers into a fever of preparation that had been the talk of the mercantile for a full fortnight. Louisa had listened to the speculation with the detached patience of a woman who understood, without bitterness, that she was not and never would be included in it. She had made 3 dresses for the occasion that were not her own, Everly Dunmore's blue silk, taken in twice at the waist and let out once to flatter a figure the girl fretted over nightly, Mrs. Abernathy's daughter Prissy's rose taffeta, its neckline adjusted at least 4 times before anyone was satisfied, and a modest grey wool for herself, mended from a dress she'd owned 8 years and let out at the seams as her own figure had softened with age. She had sat up 3 nights past midnight finishing the silk and the taffeta both, her fingers cramping over stitches meant to make other women beautiful for a man she had quietly loved, at a careful distance, since long before either of them had any notion of fortune or fashion at all. "You'll come to the dance yourself, won't you, Miss Pruett?" Everly had asked, trying on the finished silk with delighted twirls, entirely without malice, simply without the imagination to consider that her seamstress might harbour hopes of her own. "Though I don't suppose there's much reason for you to trouble with a new dress." Louisa had said only that she'd be chaperoning, and had gone home that evening and looked at her own reflection a long while cataloguing, with the same detached precision she applied to another woman's hemline, exactly how many grey hairs had crept in at her temples and how threadbare her one good grey wool had truly become. She saw him arrive from across the crowded schoolhouse floor, tall and solidly built, his dark suit a shade too formal for the occasion in a way that suggested a man unused to dressing for anything but ranch work, and she felt the old familiar ache she'd carried quietly for longer than she cared to examine too closely. She had known Walter Crane since they were both children in this same town, before his family's fortune had grown and hers had shrunk, before the gulf between them had widened into something neither of them, in 20 years, had ever tried to bridge. Miss Everly Dunmore, the banker's youngest daughter, reached him first, all bright ribbons and rehearsed laughter, and Louisa turned her attention firmly back to her needlework rather than watch the courtship unfold, because there was no dignity in watching what wasn't meant for her. "You're not dancing," a voice said, close enough to startle her, and Louisa looked up to find Walter Crane himself standing before her chair, having somehow extracted himself from Everly Dunmore's orbit with more haste than politeness generally allowed. "I'm chaperoning," Louisa said, recovering her composure with practiced speed. "Someone has to make certain Reverend Alcott's punch bowl survives the evening." "Punch bowl looks sturdy enough to me." A ghost of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, and she was struck not for the first time by how little that smile had changed since they were both young enough to race each other down Red Bluff's one dusty street. "You always did have a talent for making yourself useful instead of noticed, Louisa. I remember that about you from when we were children. I don't believe it's served you as well as you think it has." She didn't know how to answer that, and was saved from trying by Mrs. Abernathy's daughter, sweeping past on the arm of a young rancher, offering Walter a bright, calculated smile that he returned with polite indifference before turning his attention firmly back to Louisa. "I heard you took in Widow Sorrel's mending when her hands got too poor with the rheumatism to manage it herself," he said. "Heard you never once charged her for it, though you can't have much room in your own budget for charity. Who told you that? Widow Sorrel. She's not shy about singing your praises to anyone who'll listen." He studied her a moment, something searching in his gaze that made her want to look away and, contrarily, made her unable to. "It's a fine thing, Louisa, being that generous with people who can't repay you. I've noticed it about you for longer than you probably realize." Before she could untangle what he meant by that, Mrs. Abernethy inserted herself neatly into the conversation, steering Walter by the elbow toward her own daughter with the practiced firmness of a woman who had not spent a fortnight preparing for this evening only to watch her investment squandered on a penniless spinster seamstress. Walter went, with a backward glance at Louisa that she told herself meant nothing at all, and Louisa returned to her needlework and her chaperoning and the small, familiar ache of being a woman the town had long since stopped considering. She watched him dance twice with Prissy Abernethy and once with Everly Dunmore, both girls glowing with the particular brightness of women who believed the evening was unfolding exactly as they'd planned it. Told herself firmly that the tightness in her own chest was nothing more than the schoolhouse's poor ventilation. She had made her peace with this exact scene playing out, in one form or another, for the better part of 2 decades. She was not going to unmake that peace now, over a single conversation about a punch bowl and a mended dress, and yet Walter's gaze kept finding hers across the crowded floor, brief and unguarded each time, in a way that unsettled the careful peace she'd built rather more than she wanted to admit. It was near 10 o'clock, the dancing at its liveliest, when someone knocked over a lantern near the schoolhouse's back wall, where coats and shawls hung thick against the evening chill, and the dry wool caught faster than anyone standing nearby thought possible. The first cry of fire sent the whole room into a scramble of panic, dancers colliding in their haste for the doors, the band's fiddle screeching to an abrupt halt. Louisa did not run for the door. She had spent enough winters in that same rented room above the Mercantile, watching neighbors' small disasters unfold, to know that panic killed more people than fires did, and that someone needed to think clearly while everyone else thought only of themselves. She grabbed the nearest water bucket, one of several Reverend Alcott kept filled for exactly such an emergency, and began directing the men nearest her to form a line from the well pump outside, her voice carrying with an authority that startled even her. "Emmett Sorrel, get that bucket line moving. Everly, stop screaming and start passing water. You've 2 working hands, same as the rest of us." The fire was gaining on the coat wall when Louisa realized, with a lurch of pure horror, that little Hattie Sorrel, no more than 6, had wandered back inside in the chaos, drawn by some child's instinct toward her own coat hanging directly beneath the spreading flame, and was now trapped between the fire and a fallen bench no one else had noticed in the smoke and confusion. Louisa did not think. She was through the smoke and across the room before her own fear caught up with her, dragging the fallen bench aside with strength she didn't know she still possessed. Scooping Hattie up against her chest and turning back toward the door, just as a support beam near the coat wall groaned and gave way behind her, showering sparks across the floor she'd stood on moments before. Walter reached her at the threshold. Having fought his own way back through the fleeing crowd the instant he'd realized she wasn't among those already outside, and he took Hattie from her arms in one motion, passing the coughing, terrified child to her weeping mother before turning back to catch Louisa as her knees finally buckled from the smoke and the shock of it all. "I have you," he said, low and fierce, half carrying her clear of the building as the bucket line finally began to gain ground against the flames behind them. "I have you, Louisa. You're safe. Outside in the cold, clean air." The whole town watched the fire brought under control by the very bucket line Louisa had organized, watched Hattie Sorrel sobbing gratefully in her mother's arms, watched Louisa Pruett, soot-streaked and trembling, being held upright by Walter Crane's steady arms as though she were the most precious thing on the whole property. Mrs. Abernethy, who moments before had been maneuvering her daughter toward the county's richest bachelor, stood conspicuously silent at the edge of the crowd, her earlier dismissal of the seamstress's worth curdling visibly on her face. You ran back into a burning building, Walter said, once the worst of the chaos had settled and the schoolhouse's flames had been reduced to smoking ruin rather than active danger, for a child that wasn't yours, while half this town was still fighting each other to get out the door. Someone had to, Louisa said, her voice still rough with smoke. I couldn't leave her. No, Walter agreed. I don't imagine you could. It isn't in you to leave anyone who needs you, is it? Widow Sorrel's mending, tonight's fire. You've been quietly saving this town for years, Louisa, and it's taken me entirely too long to notice how thoroughly it's been happening right in front of me. She started to demur out of long habit, but he caught her hand before she could pull away, his grip warm and certain despite the chaos still settling around them. I've spent 3 years since I buried my wife letting this town parade its youngest, prettiest daughters past me like I was a prize to be won, Walter said loud enough now that those nearest could hear, and Louisa understood, with a jolt, that he meant to be heard. I let them do it because it was easier than admitting the truth, which is that not one of them ever made me feel the way I feel watching you run back into a burning building without a second thought for your own safety. You're not too old for anything, Louisa Pruett, and you're certainly not too poor to be worth choosing. I should have chosen you years ago, and I am not fool enough to make that mistake a second time. The crowd, still gathered in the cold night air around the smouldering schoolhouse, went entirely silent, and Louisa felt every eye in Red Bluff turn toward her. The same eyes that had spent a fortnight speculating about Everly Dunmore's chances, the same voices that had murmured too old and too poor from behind punch tables. Now watching the richest man in 3 counties declare himself, in front of God and the whole town, to the seamstress they'd long since stopped considering. You don't have to say this because I pulled a child from a fire, Louisa said, her voice unsteady with something that was no longer entirely fear. I'm not saying it because of the fire, Walter said. The fire only made plain what I should have said months ago. Watching you mend Widow Sorrel's dresses for nothing, watching you chaperone dances you never once let yourself enjoy, watching you make yourself small and useful and overlooked, because this town taught you to expect nothing better. I don't want small and overlooked, Louisa. I want the woman brave enough to run into fire for a stranger's child. I've wanted her for longer than I've let myself admit. Louisa searched his face in the firelight and found no performance in it, no calculation, only the same steady honesty she'd known in him since they were children racing down a dusty street together, before fortune and time had put a gulf between them that neither ever quite managed to name. Then I suppose, she said, her voice finally steadying, you'd better ask me properly, Walter Crane, instead of announcing it to the whole county first. He laughed, low and genuine, the sound of a man who'd spent 3 careful years guarding his heart finally letting the guard down entirely, and got down on one knee right there in the ash and mud outside the smoking schoolhouse, in front of Mrs. Abernathy and Everly Dunmore and every soul in Red Bluff who had ever once called her too old or too poor to matter. Louisa Pruett, he said, will you marry me? Not because the town approves, and not because tonight made a spectacle of us both, but because I have loved your steady, generous, overlooked heart for longer than I had the courage to say, and I don't intend to spend another day letting anyone, including myself, pretend otherwise. She said yes with the whole town watching, her voice clear and unashamed for the first time in longer than she could remember, and when Walter rose and kissed her, soot-streaked and smoke-stung and entirely, finally seen, the crowd that had once traded whispers about her unlikeliness broke instead into applause, because there was no arguing in that moment with a truth so plainly and publicly proven. They married before the winter snows closed the roads, in a ceremony the whole town turned out for. Everly Dunmore and Prissy Abernathy among them, both girls surprising Louisa with genuine warmth rather than lingering resentment, as though the fire had burned away something petty in the whole town along with the schoolhouse's back wall. Mrs. Abernathy herself, stiff with the effort of it, offered Louisa stilted but sincere congratulations at the reception, and Louisa, who had never been a woman to hold a grudge she could instead set down, accepted it with more grace than the woman likely expected. Widow Sorrel wept through the entire ceremony, little Hattie clutching a fistful of wild flowers she'd insisted on gathering herself for the occasion, and told anyone who'd listened that she'd known, the very night of the fire, exactly how the story would end. Because she'd watched Louisa Pruitt spend years being the kindest, steadiest woman in Red Bluff, and had simply been waiting for the rest of the town to catch up to what was plain as daylight to anyone paying proper attention. Louisa Crane, seamstress no longer out of necessity but by choice, stood at the center of a life she had long since stopped believing she deserved to hope for. She thought, watching Walter across the room at their own wedding supper, of every whispered dismissal she'd swallowed in silence over the years, too poor, too easily overlooked, and understood at last that the town's judgment had never once been the true measure of her worth. It had simply taken the right man and one terrible, illuminating night for the whole of Red Bluff to finally see what Walter Crane had known all along, that the woman they'd spent years dismissing had been, the entire time, the most worth choosing of anyone in the county.